Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I'm the director of the Kennan Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today to discuss Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine, calls to decolonize research, and the teaching of Russian studies in the United States. A few words of background. I encourage everyone to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our two blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, as well as our podcasts, Kennan X and the Russia File. I also would like to acknowledge the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies and the Carnegie Corporation of New York for supporting the assessment conducted by Dr. Gerber and Michael Zaslavsky that we are analyzing today. To our online audience, if you have questions for our speaker, you can submit questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page at any time. Please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. I want to briefly introduce our speaker today. Professor Theodore Gerber is the Conway Bascom's Professor of Sociology and Director of the Wisconsin-Russia Project at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Some of his most recent publications include How Kinship Networks Affect the Small Business and Performance in Kyrgyzstan, and also the Displacement on Subjective Well-Being in Ukraine. So, without much ado, Ted, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Oh, I gotta turn this. Thank you. So it's a pleasure to be here and to report on the results of this assessment study that I did. And I also want to acknowledge my co-author is a PhD student in my program at University of Wisconsin. As well, I should thank already the Project Advisory Committee for this assessment, which consisted of Bella Gregorian, Juliet Johnson, Linda Park, Karen Petrone, and Alexandra Vacru. So, okay, the background to this is that even before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, even before COVID, for a while now, the role of area studies in the American Academy has been contested, debated, and somewhat problematic. To make a long and complicated story short, because most universities are structured in the United States, are structured around departments, which are in turn structured around academic disciplines, there's really not much of an institutional home in American universities for centers that really focus on the study of particular regions. And as a result, although at the same time, I should say that there's a perceived need on the part of various stakeholders in academia and also in the society for regional focused expertise that's cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, really rooted in deep understanding of the region. So these two conflicting sorts of pressures have made for an uncomfortable role for interdisciplinary regional studies programs in general, including but not only limited to Russian studies. Furthermore, Russian studies has had a particularly rough time in recent decades following the decline or the end of the Cold War as a result of a perceived decline of interest in Russia, reflecting this sort of sense in the United States that the Cold War is over, that was a big rationale for investing a lot of resources in the study of Russia. And even prior to Russia's full-scale invasion, there were some recent negative developments, say the 5 years preceding February 2022, including a growing crackdown on civic and academic freedoms within Russia, which made it much harder for Russia-based scholars to conduct their research, to establish collaborations with American scholars. Also, the heightened tensions between the United States and Russia made it more difficult to obtain visas, to encourage sort of travel back and forth in both directions. And then finally, the COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, it shut down international travel in general. It made it really difficult and challenging to sustain sort of research trips and also travel to present work and so forth. So all these factors leading up to this assessment did not bode particularly well for the fate of Russian studies. Now, this project was funded by Carnegie Corporation of New York, and I want to thank the corporation for funding it. I think they gave a grant to ACs, which made this work possible. And it's actually the second study of this nature. So I was also fortunate enough to be involved in the first round, which was conducted in 2015, and that covered the years 2009 through 2014. So the initial motive for this particular study and it was conceived and funded before the full-scale invasion, it was sort of take stock of what had transpired in the field of Russian studies since the last study, that is, since 2015. In particular, focused on the impact of the adverse developments that I've already mentioned, the crackdown on civic and academic freedoms within Russia, spiraling U.S.-Russia tensions, and also COVID-19. Well, of course, so we were all set to go. We were planning to start the study in March of 2022, but then, of course, the invasion happened. So that led us to pause because it didn't really seem like a good idea, like literally, a week or so after the invasion, to just jump ahead and go forth with the sort of questions about the impact of COVID and so forth. So we took a little delay, but then we decided to proceed, figuring like, well, okay, we should just shift our emphasis a little bit and focus more on what I'm really going to focus on today, which is the impact of the full-scale invasion on Russian studies based in the United States. I want to be clear that that's the population we're looking at, like U.S.-based researchers. And also the corresponding rise of calls to decolonize the field or decenter Russia within Slavic studies, both of which, not surprisingly, sort of crowded out everything else in terms of, what's really going on in Russian studies. So the data collection began in mid-May of 2022, and it lasted through January of this year. So the broad questions addressed were, prior to the full-scale invasion, what had been the main trends in Russian studies since 2015. And there's a long-standing interest in some specific aspects of the trends, such as the collaborations between U.S.-based and Russia-based scholars, in particular. Then how did the COVID pandemic, those adverse, three adverse trends that I already discussed, what was their impact? But what I'm going to focus today is the two new questions we added. So what have been the impacts of the February 2022 invasion and ongoing full-scale war? And then how do the Russian studies practitioners themselves, that is scholars who are based in the U.S., who do work on Russia, how have they responded to the growing calls to decolonize the field? Okay, and with which I presume everybody's familiar, but I'll say a little bit more about what those mean. So the methodology was to study these topics from within. That is to really focus on how practitioners of the field themselves view these particular issues, both the impact of the war and also the calls for decolonization. And we gathered data from 4 different sources. So first of all, I conducted interviews with 16 government officials, think tank researchers, and academic researchers, mainly located in D.C., who really are known for their policy focus. Because one of the points of the study, in addition to studying U.S.-Russia collaborations, was to try to understand how effective Russia studies scholars are at bringing their research to the attention of public officials who are responsible for making policy. So Carnegie has always been concerned with the need for diverse perspectives, the need to bring academic research to the attention of policymakers. And so one of the questions was, how good are we doing? And so, I wanted to get the sense not only of academics, but also of think tank researchers whose main job is to do that sort of thing, and also government officials who work on Russia. And so I did talk to a number of them. Then we did virtual focus groups, which, and again, that is one nice thing about the Zoom world, and, hello to all those who are watching via Zoom. That is maybe the only good thing that came out of the pandemic, is it broadens our reach. So we were able to set up virtual focus groups with 3 groups of academics from different disciplines who are currently based in U.S. institutions and are doing work on Russia. Graduate students, assistant professors, or recently tenured associate professors, and then full professors. So sort of grouped by seniority, but 3 interdisciplinary groups. And then we did 2 surveys. So most importantly, we did a survey of U.S.-based researchers themselves, and the criteria for this was you had to be based at a U.S. institution and have done some kind of research on Russia in the last 5 years in order to qualify. And we used the AC's membership list, PONAR's membership list, other sorts of lists to send out the survey, and we had 438 respondents. And then we did a survey of U.S.-based university programs and centers in Russian studies, and for that we had a response of 20 that tapped into sort of more institutional dynamics. All right, so that's lots of different data. I'm just going to briefly run through some findings prior to the war, and then I'll focus on today's main topics. So what we found is that even before the war, there were some continuing problems that were sort of persisted from the prior study, and then perhaps accelerated. A decline in the intake of students into PhD programs in the various disciplines. A decline in Russia-focused PhDs who are being supervised currently, reported by the departments that responded to our survey. Also a decline in faculty with Russia expertise in those departments. We find continuing declines in Russia-related language and substantive course taking. So, we are able to identify when our survey respondents graduated, when they received their PhDs, those who did so. And there is a continuing trend of less and less course taking about Russia specifically, and also less language. Now, some of this may be offset by a growing influx of foreign nationals, people from Russia itself who are involved in U.S. PhD programs. But I think the declines and the numbers were substantial enough to offset any sort of countervailing tendency. Because, of course, native Russian speakers aren't going to take courses in Russian in their PhD programs. We see some declines in publications in terms of just the sheer volume of publications reported per respondent in 11 different categories of publications by research active scholars. So even those who are publishing something, there's less work coming out about Russia in most categories. Actually, one of the major exceptions to that is peer-reviewed articles in disciplinary journals, which is really steady from one evaluation to the next. So that's one area in which the field has done a good job at maintaining a presence, so to speak. And also decline, not surprisingly, given COVID at least, and also the visa issues I mentioned, in the number and average duration of research trips that U.S.-based researchers have taken to Russia in the last 5 years. Finally, we saw a greater tendency to move away over the course of one's career from doing work on Russia. And so we got at this by asking people to compare, to state what percentage of their research activity did they devote to Russia when they were doing their PhD versus currently. And you see a slippage. We give people quintiles, and people decline. 31% of the respondents do less work now on Russia than they had during their PhDs. 12.5% are doing more work, so there is some countervailing trend. But clearly it's offset, and the rate at which that drift is happening increased over time compared to the 2015 assessment. So there are some signs of resilience. It's not all terrible news that despite all the obstacles, that the rates of collaboration with Russia-based scholars did remain steady in the recent assessment compared to the prior one. We see tenure line in academic employment for researchers who have PhDs who are working on Russia in, say, political science or history. That has remained fairly steady. We also see, as I mentioned, in the peer-reviewed disciplinary outlets, there is steady rates of publication there, and particularly the social scientists and historians have a little bit of an uptick, offsetting a slight decline among Slavicists or Slavic language and literature folks. Grant funding has remained fairly strong, and so there's no notable decline in that particular important area. We see lots of methodological and topical diversity by America-based researchers who are doing work on Russia, based on topics, based on methods. Really, a favorable picture came from that perspective. We do see that there's less perception of anti-Russian bias. So in the 2015, there was a notable tendency for some, for researchers who do work on Russia to think that there's anti-Russian bias either in academia or the media, and there's somewhat of less of a tendency. Now, maybe it's just because attitudes towards Russia have really soured, so what used to be perceived as bias is now perceived as reflecting reality. I don't know, I'm speculating, and that's not, so I'm just telling you one possible interpretation, but we do find less concern about anti-Russian bias among U.S. academics. And also, I would say the subjective perceptions of the quality of the research. Now, it's hard to measure quality in a quantitative way, but at least in terms of both survey responses and the interviews I conducted, people were generally impressed with the quality of work that had been come out about Russia in all fields, in history, political science, and so forth. So overall, the field was quite resilient. I was actually surprised myself that the things weren't worse than they turned out to be, given the extent of the challenges that the field has faced. There tended to be a lot of emphasis in the qualitative part of the research on some of the accomplishments. I mean, maybe people feel a little defensive these days, but they certainly tended to emphasize the good more than the bad. So overall, the picture in early 2022, on the eve of the full-scale invasion, was one of impressive Russia-related research activity by U.S.-based scholars, despite the challenges posed by the pandemic and also U.S.-Russia tensions and the crackdown within Russia. So overall, the picture was one of, considerable resilience, and the Russian studies community up to the war had more or less maintained the course despite some considerable headwinds. Okay, what about the war? So, the war hit the field really hard. So let's start with the government and think tank world. So what came out of my discussions with, and mainly that's my main source of data here, like we had a few sort of think tankers complete the survey, but mostly it was from the qualitative part. Well, my impression was, the impression that I got from my interlocutors was that the U.S. Policymakers really feel that the invasion is crowded out. Perhaps not surprisingly, and maybe in some ways none of this is particularly surprising, but the invasion and the tensions with Russia involving the war have crowded any other topic, any other theme, any other strategic thinking. Like right now, the U.S. government, according to the people I talked to, is completely absorbed with trying to counter Russia's actions in Ukraine. And also elsewhere in the world. And they also spoke of a long-standing polarization of opinions within the U.S. policymaking and adjacent communities, so that would be the think tank community, a polarization between those who seek to understand the Russian position, who say we should be empathetic, or perhaps from purely practical grounds we need to compromise, we need to find a solution, to those who advocate a more confrontationist, or some would say hawkish position, where they perceive where they believe that the U.S. has to recognize Russia is just an enemy, and we need to confront, the U.S. needs to confront the enemy. And so this sort of polarization had been brewing for quite some time, but by all the accounts by folks on both sides of this divide, it really was accelerated to the point where deeply entrenched, calcified, rigid positions, and there's sort of no space in between for voices or perspectives to try to bridge these two opposing viewpoints. So that polarization really came out quite strongly in some of the interviews. And then others suggested that, so I asked my interlocutors about whether or not academic research plays any role in government discussions. And basically, the results were fairly skeptical, although there were some folks who said they do occasionally read academic works, and some of their others who don't, but some of their best friends do, kind of thing. But really, and I think this is not going to be a surprise to this audience, but I think a lot of academics might be surprised to hear that actually government officials don't read academic studies, then they're not planning to, and they don't see any value in doing so. And generally, the message I got quite consistently is like, well, the best way, if academics want to influence government policy, the best way to do so is to teach courses where future government policymakers will take during master's studies, and try to use that venue to sort of spread some of the knowledge about the region. So that was sort of the main kinds of effects about the war that I got from the qualitative part with respect to policymakers and think tankers. What about in academia? Well, as I put it in the report, or as we put it in the report, Michael helped with writing some sections. So the full-scale invasion really hit the field like a tsunami. If initially the ship was kind of navigating troubled waters, and boom, it was really quite an emotional time. And again, keep in mind that these interviews were done, in summer of 2022, spring and summer 2022. So it was still quite fresh. So maybe I think I'm going to conclude by suggesting that things might have settled down a little bit, but people were really quite distressed in the academic community who study Russia. So, for example, historians said we're in a delicate, dangerous position. People talk about Russia in a way that essentialized Russians. It's very concerning. We as students, we know how diverse Russia is. We have to keep making keep pushing that message. But metaphors such as earthquake or such as like a massive disruption, I mean, those came up again and again. It's important to recognize, and the field broadly recognized it, that yes, I mean, both in the United States and in generally throughout the Euro-Atlantic Alliance, which I guess would include countries like Japan and so forth, that Russia has been widely seen as responsible for the war. and people have been appalled by, now maybe not so much in the global south, but the academia is not immune to those kinds of sentiments. And for people who've spent their lives, their careers really focused on studying a country which all of a sudden is now has full pariah status, it creates a lot of discomfort. It creates a lot of a sort of unease about what the role of researchers who've been studying Russia has been over the years. There were some commentators, both within academia and outside, who not only blamed the Russian regime, but also who still blame the Russian people. There have been calls for the war, for Russia's aggressive actions. There have been calls to boycott Russian academics along with Russian athletes and cultural figures, and send Russian students packing and these kind of things. Now, those have sort of receded with respect to the academic side of things, but early, even in April of 2022, you did hear calls to really apply the sanctions not only to those other realms, but also to academics. So that posed a lot of concerns for Americans, who work with scholars and with students, and who adhere to the universalism of academic life. Let's call it that. Questions were raised about how well U.S. experts had done at anticipating the war. So the argument was put out that had the American-based scholarly community of experts on Russia better understood Russia, then the war could have been prevented. I mean, there's people who actually take that rather extreme position, but short of that, there's a lot of soul searching, because the sense was that the U.S. Expert community in political science, in history, in cultural studies failed to understand just how hell-bent on invading Putin was, failed to warn people, failed to advocate for policies to bolster Ukraine's defense in advance of the invasion, and so forth. And then, of course, the urgent calls to decolonize the field, which it was sort of a long brewing set of tensions and concerns and grievances by members of the research community who work on countries other than Russia, or who work on peoples within Russia other than ethnic Russians, and so on and so forth, that they really came to a fore and were given a huge impetus by the levels of upset about the war itself. So in terms of the impact of the war, there was certainly a perceived decline in the diversity of perspectives, like a sense that fears even of sort of, as I'll say next, a rise of McCarthyism, pressure to self-center, a sense that researchers that research, even trying to take a neutral sort of stance towards Russia, is no longer acceptable. That in one's research, one has to come to conclusions that are very critical of Russia, critical of the Russian government, pointing out negative aspects, even to the point where there is pressure to self-center, self-censor. One anthropologist talked about how they felt really compelled to sort of apologize for their findings, to say, well, I know it's wrong, I don't know how this has happened, but this is what the people I talked to said, and so and so it really creates a sort of awkwardness, a sense that academic objectivity is no longer is sort of jeopardized by the very strong anti-Russian sense in some corners of the academy, but also in the larger society. Some people referred to McCarthyism in academia, and then there were some fears that political litmus tests were being applied in journal reviews and grant reviews and things like that. There's also, of course, a big sense that as a result of the war and the corresponding crackdown, it's really very hard for those of us who do work on Russia to be able to continue the types of data collection that we became accustomed to in the post-Cold War era. So archives shut down, impossible to travel, to Russia for at least for American citizens. I mean, maybe some Europeans or some dual citizens can still do so, but then doing field work there really is just inconceivable. People feel differently about surveys. I myself, as a long-term survey researcher, I'll quote myself as skeptical of most of the survey work that's done in Russia now, although I wouldn't make a blanket statement. I think there is, some good work being done. But, basically, those of us who've been doing work on Russia using archival methods, using standard social science, or, I guess the Slavicists, they can still read Pushkin and watch Russian movies, but in the other disciplines, the being cut off from data is a very painful and challenging situation. And then finally, our Russian colleagues, who many of us over the years have been striving to establish stronger ties with, to integrate in our research programs. They are jeopardized and they are imperiled. It's very dangerous for many of them to continue to work if they're still in Russia. And many of them, of course, have left and fled, and Russian universities have been utterly devastated by the Putin regime, in connection with the war. But process it was already underway. Okay, so the qualitative and the quantitative components, they show that the war, it really left many scholars of Russia reeling. It's upended the way that we were accustomed to doing business, and I'm speaking collectively just for convenience. Practicing the trade for which many people have invested their careers in. So, and I want to be clear that it's not. I don't want to make this sound like this is sort of a self-absorbed, self-pitying thing. Like everybody I interviewed and talked to would say that, of course, the main victims of this war have not been U.S. scholars, they've been Ukrainians, they've been others who've been victimized by Russian aggression. So I really want to acknowledge that. But at the same time, it really has dealt a harsh blow to U.S.-based scholars who do work in Russia. So there's a lot of despair. So 80, and it comes up in the quantitative research, the quantitative survey as well. So 89% assess the impact of the war in Russia, or the impact of the war on research about Russia in their discipline as very negative, and another 3% as somewhat negative. And so same for the impact of the war on the ability to do research on Russia moving forward. And that dwarfs the impact of COVID, of other aspects, which are also viewed as negative, but not nearly by as many of the survey respondents. Actually, there's surprisingly little variation across disciplines. So I divide the sample into three large discipline areas: Slavists, humanists, Slavish/humanists, historians, and then social scientists, most of whom are political scientists, but there's also sociologists such as myself and others. And there's really, in very few of the survey items do we see substantial, at least statistically significant variations across disciplines. Younger scholars are especially understood to be affected, so there's a lot of concerns expressed particularly about recruiting new folks into the field, without the opportunity to go to Russia to do field work, without, and with, concerns that the field itself is in decline. So why would you go into this field if you're a young, aspiring researcher? Maybe you want to study China or the Middle East or something. I don't know. So, but that's a sort of perennial concern, and it's only seems to be worsened. And indeed, we saw evidence. We asked people about their own research plans, and we saw a number of people being pushed away, according to their own account, from doing work on Russia to doing work on research. So I have some, quotes that I put up here. I don't want to sit here and read, but you can kind of look at them while I'm talking, and they sort of show how, so there were some counter perspectives. I want to, emphasize that it wasn't a uniform picture in any of these questions. So some people did actually see that there was a potential for increased interest in Russia, but that was sort of tempered by a sense that, yes, the war may drive some scholars to want to do work on Russia because they're motivated by wanting to serve the U.S. government and its, fight with Russia or something like that. But the concern was that would attract military/security types. I don't know exactly what that refers to, but that's a often heard phrase among academics. Military types who want to work for the CIA. They're not interested in the true knowledge that academics are interested in. But that, that is, so it's not just about the quantity of students going into the study of Russia, but a sense of what their aims and motivations are. There's a little bit, some hints of variation by discipline. And so in some areas, there's a sense that, Russian studies were improving, but that was really from the qualitative part, not so much from the quantitative. All right, so in terms of the future of the war, I have some very specific findings. And again, I'll show you the link at the end. The full report is available. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, more quickly than you'll have time for. But if you're interested, you can look at the report. And there's lots of tables in there of the survey. There's lots of quotations from the interviews. It's a long report. There's a 3-page executive summary. So you can have a look. But we do see that there's widespread skepticism, especially about the opportunities to be able to do work on Russia for U.S.-based scholars moving forward, ability to collaborate with Russian-based scholars. willingness to collaborate with them, especially those based in government-sponsored universities still in Russia. There's even fewer American-based scholars who say they're willing to collaborate with those based in Russian institutions. And there's concern about the ability of our various disciplines to recruit graduate students into the field who will do work. Much more optimism about the impact of work of interest in Russia, and even more so in Ukraine. So a lot of the researchers say, well, it certainly has raised a lot of awareness and interest in Ukraine, and a lot of people are moving from doing work on Russia to doing work on Ukraine, and that could be a good thing. And it's certainly consistent with what the decolonization proponents are seeking to accomplish. And then sort of mixed views. So I have, I think you probably can't really read that, but so this is sort of some of the specific survey items. I'm not going to go through them in detail. I'm just going to summarize them. But again, I refer you to please consult the report if you're interested in some of the specific items, because I want to get through. Okay, in terms of research on this, the impact of the war on people's own research, same picture, very negative. So about 50% said they ended projects on Russia as a result of the war. They redirected focus, or they redirected focus to other countries in the region. Some people did start new projects on Russia, but also even more so on Ukraine and on other countries in the region. There's actually less quantitative evidence of people ending affiliations with Russian institutions and scholars. So I expected to see a lot more than that we actually see. And then 20% have started new collaborations with displaced scholars from Russia. So the increase of research on displaced scholars is another important trend. Again, I apologize for the small type, but if you want to glance quickly at some of those items, you can see those are the specific sort of survey items on which my prior assertions were just based. All right, then I know I want to take another just 5 minutes or so to talk some more specifically about decolonization. So actually, so decolonization is actually, I think, if anything, what I would summarize the punchline is this, that actually within the community of Russia researchers, so this is not, people who don't do work on Russia, who have been, but rather people who have been criticized by people perhaps who do less work on Russia of being too focused on Russia, but there's actually a lot of sympathy and a lot of empathy as well. And I say what really came out both in the qualitative and in the qualitative research is that within the field, there's actually a lot more support for the goals of the so-called decolonization movement, although I use that word cautiously. I don't think it's really a movement, but than one might expect from the outset. So some believe that the movements along the lines of decolonization have actually been underway for a while, so this isn't exactly new. And then there is the issue of whether or not people within the field, as Russia researchers based in the U.S., would support decolonization if it came down to a trade-off, if they had to make a sacrifice. And so there's almost universal support quantitatively for the goals of decolonization, but only about half or even slightly under half actually support if the question is posed in such a way that requires sacrificing resources invested in the study of Russia. So that's where you sort of reach, you reach a sort of more kind of serious discussion. Like, of course, in principle, anyone can support more research on, indigenous people in Russia, more research on Ukraine, more research on Eastern Europe, on Central Asian countries, decentering Russia. But then when it comes down to, allocating resources, if it's a zero-sum game, there's less willingness on the part of the Russian researchers to part with resources that are focused on Russia. And so, again, I have, stuff that you can't probably read, but I just want to give you a sense. Maybe I'll just focus on some of the italicized words here. So, people, this is one political scientist who, comments that people are shifting away from doing work on Russia, and Russian researchers themselves are moving to do work on Ukraine, on Central Asia, and this political scientist says, it's a good thing, expanding the horizon of political science, bringing more countries into the fold. And then others saying, well, yes, of course, we agree with decolonization. This is a think tank research. Russia has been treated as somehow special because of its history and culture that has led to a profound misunderstanding. Okay, so this think tanker supports decolonization. And so the range is from very positive to sort of more views, like the support with caveats. So, so one political scientist commented that yes, it's great that there should be more work on Ukraine, more work on Central Asian studies. But actually, if you read further, more work on ethnic minorities. But actually, if you read further, they say, well, actually, we've been doing this for a while. There has been an expansion of attention, so it's a bit of an exaggeration, perhaps, on the part of the critics who say, well, Russia has just crowded everything else. And actually, I remember myself in the 90s reading a whole lot about, nationalist movements in various other, Ukraine and Kyrgyzstan and so forth. But then, one think tank researcher puts rather bluntly sort of perspective to say Russia can destroy us in a matter of hours, Kyrgyzstan cannot. Why should I care about Kyrgyzstan? That's sort of the practical, hard-headed response for justifying why we should still focus most of our efforts and attention on Russia. A few other sort of, so there's reservations about the maximalist version, so to speak, of decolonization, saying that, okay, it's great to expand research to other areas, but when you're talking about shutting down research programs about Russia, that's just not acceptable. We can't do that. And then, the sense that, this has also been underway, but the reality is it's easier to publish a paper in a political science journal. It just gets down to brass tacks. It's easier to publish work on Russia than it is work about other countries. And so, that has to be kept in mind in terms of the interests of young scholars. Okay, so a little bit of a mixed picture. Some concern about relations between Ukrainian and Russian scholars. Okay, but I want to conclude to open up the floor. So apart from these caveats, there's widespread support for the decolonization movement. So again, I have a bunch of numbers, but the punchline here is that decolonization, and I would focus on the middle section there. So which statement do you agree with? I do not support devoting more resources or publishing opportunities for research about Eurasian countries other than Russia in my discipline. Only 6% agree with that, saying let's stay with the status quo. But then the rest are divided between whether they support it unconditionally or whether they support it only insofar as it does not divert resources away from research about Russia. So that expand the pie, don't take some of the existing pie away from Russia and give it to other countries. That's sort of and that's, again, not a vast majority, but 54%. Okay, then we went through the different goals of decolonization. There's sort of support, identification of all of them, all the ones I mentioned already. And half say decolonization has been underway for a while in terms of the survey responses. So that is a widespread perception on the part of people in the various disciplines that this isn't new. We've been struggling with this. We've been trying to get this done for a while now. Mixed views on and so forth. And also there's a lot of skepticism about the claim that, had decolonization happened more thoroughly or more effectively earlier, then the war would have been stopped. Although actually 28% of the survey respondents agree with that statement. Okay, so again, please see the report for the more details. I'm going to conclude. Most scholars in the field were really hit very hard. They've been horrified. It's been very disruptive. There's no hope, I don't think, in any corners of ever returning to the status quo ante, the world before February 22. People in the fields in the various disciplines are grappling with how to sort of shift their research, their training goals, their orientations to take into account the new situation that, either by working on other countries in the region, by exploring new methods, by collaborating with Russian exiled scholars, by thinking of creative ways and new data approaches, which I can talk about in the Q&A if people are interested. There are 5 recommendations in the report. Maintain as much access to data as possible. Think of new ways. There's some ways listed there. Try to protect Russian scholars in exile, even as we try to, assist and support Ukrainian scholars who've been affected by the war, Belarusian, Armenian now, Azerbaijani scholars. Many scholars in the region are affected, but we shouldn't turn our back on the Russian scholars, is my recommendation for the sake of Russian studies. We should continue to try to educate the U.S. public and the U.S. policymakers about the diversity and complexity of Russian society and avoid reductive essentialism where we say, oh, Russians are all just a bunch of fascists who love totalitarian dictators and that's all there is to say and why waste time saying anything more. I mean, that we need, as experts who understand that Russia is a very large, complex, and diverse society, we need to do what we can to try to maintain that perspective about Russia's diversity. we have to be worried about young scholars entering the field, and we also need to dialogue as Russia researchers with those who are emphasizing decolonization to try to reach an understanding, to understand their positions, not to reject them outright, and not to get defensive. I mean, they have some valid claims, and they make some of them make extreme demands. Others, or many of them, are very reasonable, and it's incumbent on us to listen to them. So, those are my recommendations. This is where you can find the report, and that concludes my presentation. So sorry to go on a little bit longer than usual.
Thanks so much, Ted. And to our online audience, if you have questions for our speaker, you can submit questions via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. Well, I want to begin by asking a question on decolonization. And as the war has continued, and clearly the human rights violations in Ukraine and other violations have increased, was there certain divisions on how decolonization would take place? Would it be kind of just Ukraine and Russia, or was there a growing sense that they needed to decolonize the Russian Federation and all the different ethnic minorities?
Yes, that's a great question. So now keep in mind again that my population that I was studying here are people who do
I know
research
that.
on Russia. So not just Ukrainian scholars who have only worked on Ukraine or Central Asia. And so I would say that there's an appreciation for, there's a broad view of what the goals of decolonization are and should be. And they include both more research, not just Ukraine, but on other countries in the region. Also, it's perhaps a somewhat subtle point, but the idea is that, okay, we should not only study Ukraine more and study, countries like Kyrgyzstan. I mean, I do work on Kyrgyzstan, so that comes up a lot. But the idea is we should study them more, but also less through a Russian lens. Like we should study Kyrgyzstan not only as far as, this is what Russia's trying to do in Kyrgyzstan. This is Russia's goals in Kyrgyzstan. Is Russia accomplishing aims in Kyrgyzstan? How do Kyrgyzstanis feel about Russians? But more of an attempt to sort of appreciate these countries as having rich and important and socially, scientifically, or historically interesting or culturally interesting societies and cultures and politics in their own right. And I think that is a widely shared view. I think, as academics at least, they tend to, they tend not to like this notion that we should only do research for geopolitical instrumental reasons, that we have, pure political science theories that we want to test. We have pure understanding of culture in all its rich, diverse forms that we want to explore and develop. We have sociological theories. And so those aspects, I think, are quite widely supported. In terms of supporting the complexity, studies of the complexity of Russian society and its indigenous people, I think there's a sense in some disciplines like, hey, like anthropologists, like just about all anthropology about Russia, not all, but just about all anthropology about Russia the last 30 years has been focused on Buryats or on, Evenks or on, various Tatars. And so, part of that varies by discipline. And there's a lot of, I think you find support for all the various aspects of it within the Russian studies community. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think, I didn't identify one particular strand of decolonization that has more support than the others.
So when talking to academics and talking about whether they encourage people to pursue a PhD, which is a very long road, as a few of us know here, with no definite rewards, are they still encouraging people to do a PhD, or are they placing them in master's degrees? To what extent is the PhD really the goal for all of these people trying to get just in the field of Russian studies?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I can answer more based on my personal experience, as someone who's been in this field for a long time. I do think it's absolutely the case that many, people whose full-time job is to be a professor, there is sort of a core assumption that, yes, it's worth getting a PhD and that everybody should get a PhD. I do think that there is a growing recommendation. So I think maybe this is a time in the field for us to have conversations, and I hear increasing numbers of such conversations about maybe we should take a different approach, and that academics are, academic PhD training is very focused on reproducing PhDs, academics reproducing themselves, and believe me, I think what academics do is valuable. I don't think that, I think there is a role, but I think also not just because of the full-scale invasion and not just because of decolonization. I think in general, universities are under a lot of pressure in American society right now, and there's a lot of forces which are pressing universities to do more to demonstrate their contributions, not just to reproducing academic research and abstract theoretical education at various levels, but also making a contribution to other societal goals, be they in the realm of private enterprise, but also in the realm of government. And so, I do think there is perhaps a growing appreciation for the necessity of emphasizing master's programs, emphasizing the types of programs that will generate experts to go into fields such as cybersecurity, the oil and gas industry, not just pure government occupations doing foreign service, but including that as well. And I think there is a growing appreciation, not just because of the war and decolonization, but also because of growing debates about the role of the university in American society. So I think that is definitely a noticeable trend.
We are looking for questions online, but does anyone have any questions in the room?
Thank you very much for the brilliant report. Very interesting. But actually, what was a big question mark from the very beginning, and I still struggling to understand this. Decolonization, this diverting attention to different countries, is one thing that people who are studying Russia would say, okay, let's study Ukraine as well. But the real decolonization is not when you are adding, more territories or more nations or like whatever, more areas of your studies. Is the way that you change the perspective on what you studied. Is say the current war between Russia and Ukraine is exactly because there is a different view on the Russian history. As Ukrainians see Russian history in one way, and Russians see Russian history in another way. And they are debating about a lot of joint things. And what I got an impression from your report is that the US-based scholars actually do not yet recognize that. They are thinking about to diversifying rather than changing their perspective. Is that right? Have you seen the notion of changing the perspective of the studies?
Well, thanks for the question, and I think you're absolutely right that does get to an aspect of decolonization where it's a matter of perspective. So first of all, I'm not a historian, and I think perhaps this is one area where the debate, from what I understand from talking to historians, where it's really more pronounced within history. Now, I've heard people say the range of things. I've heard some scholars who say, but wait, in history, we recognize that Russia was an imperial force which sought to, dominate and exploit. And others who say, no, we still have a long way to go. So I can't speak to the debates among historians because I'm not a historian. So I would be.
It's not just history, it's linguistics, it's culture, and it's politics.
Well, so I can't speak to politics, and I think I guess I would beg to differ. I don't think that So I mean, I'm not a political scientist, but I know a lot of them, and I collaborated with them, and I think the notion that political scientists embrace sort of a Russian world perspective is just, I mean, to me, it just is wrong. Like I think maybe in choice of topics is, but if you look at the work that's been published by American-based political science about Russia, I mean, they work on corruption, they work on, some of them work on political. Yes, some political scientists advocate for, measures of, peacemaking or reconciliation, or what somebody could say, making concessions to Russia. But I think it's important to try to be systematic. Like, yes, I could tell you some political scientists I know who have come out saying, well, Ukraine really should negotiate with Russia. Of course, I'm not denying that there are some. But to characterize the whole approach as if there's somehow that's the dominant perspective, that's what I just don't think it's accurate, and nor do the people who I speak to who are someone like, well, yes, of course, some of our colleagues, but there's a diversity of views, is the point. That there's not sort of a lockstep, mainstream, conventional wisdom that, Russia has this interest and Ukraine is just a peripheral part of Russia's interest, and that's the lens. It's not that nobody adopts that view, but I would say it's much more the minority. So that's my perspective. And so I think, I think it would be an interesting separate research project to do using various techniques of, you could do sort of content analysis you can do, but I'd be really curious to see, actually the work that's out there. Like, is it really majority slanted one way or the other in terms of the Russia versus Ukraine dynamic? But my own sense, honestly, is that there's not, a huge bias in favor of the pro-Russian perspective in social science specifically. That's what. And certainly if you look at anthropologists, anthropologists, when they work, not so much, but if they're working on indigenous people, almost all of that work that I've read is sort of trying to champion the cause of the people who they're studying. It's like, look, these people have been oppressed by this colonial power and their languages are being wiped out and they're trying to find ways to make their peace with, the challenges of living in this system where they don't have any power and they're trying to maintain their traditions and cultures and so forth. So I don't know. I really don't see much evidence of like a pro-Russian imperial mindset in the social science, which is that I'm most familiar with.
Okay. Andre, and if you could please state your name and affiliation.
Andrei Larionov, Center for Security Policy. May I ask you to ask two questions concerning the two most important, the most regular cited words. One is war and another decolonization. Can you give us your forecast? What kind of impact will be on the Russian studies in three possible versions of the event? Russia wins this war, Russia is being defeated in this war, or war of attrition continues endlessly. So which would increase attention and resources and everything else to the Russian studies, and in which cases it would decrease? This is the first question. And the other one is about decolonization. If, let's assume, at least a classical understanding of decolonization, and we will see appearance of new states on the territory of the Russian Federation. We are not talking about for Ukraine right now, or Belarus, but about, let's say, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Yakutia, Chechnya, whatever. So are we going to see new areas of studies, like along with Russian studies, Bashkir studies, Karelian studies, Chechen studies, Yakutia studies, or all those people who will be studying those areas will be still having the same cover, Russian studies, if they are not Russian by any way?
Wow, well, those are really two excellent and very difficult questions. So let me start with the first one. I think that's a great, that is a great sort of, what's the word? It's a great, I don't want to say game, but it's a great thought exercise to go through. Like, so what if Russia wins the war? What if Ukraine wins the war? What if there's a long-term stalemate? I guess offhand, and I would think that, if Russia's defeated in the war and, Ukraine is victorious, then I think probably there will be less volume of Russian studies. I think that, if a defeated Russia, now, a lot of it depends on how Russia's defeated, right? And what Russia does after it's defeated and who takes over, if, as I would expect, and probably many do, if Russia's defeat would be accompanied by the downfall of the regime, what's going to happen, the Putin regime, what's going to happen in Russia. But I would think that, probably for Russian studies, there would be less sort of resources invested in supporting research on Russia, but maybe more of a shift towards like longer term, less security oriented emphases. If Russia wins or if the war continues in the status quo, I think it's going to be about more, is fairly stable. It's hard for you to imagine like Russia winning and then, 10 years down the road, there's some kind of rapprochement and the West accepts Russia's victory and starts to, support. Maybe, but I really think that's far-fetched. So I think we're going to get the status quo. I think, if Russia's defeated in the war, I think it won't necessarily be good or bad, but it'll sort of be a shift in Russia studies more, but again, in the short term, Russia's going to be a big problem if it loses the war. For sure, it's going to be, it's hard to imagine any happy scenario where, Russia kind of peacefully evolves. And so that into liberal democracy that is then just like other nation states. I think that's kind of fanciful thinking. And so I think either way, like Russian studies is going to be around. Like I don't think Russia is going to go away as a perceived important major political threat. In terms of like the Russian culture stuff, like I do think whatever happens, like that ship is sailed. Like I think there's a lot of people who are just like less interested in Russian culture now, less interested in Russian history because they just don't, the appeal of it is a bit tarnished. Like let's just put it, I'm not speaking for myself, but I'm saying there's a lot of sense that Russia is not cool. Russia is not Russia is just this country that's mercilessly attacked in terms of how it's framed, and so that no matter what happens in the war, that's going to I think have a lasting impact. In terms of decolonization studies, so I think you could go back even a step. You can think like, well, what is Eurasia? Like Eurasia is a concept of the Cold War. Eurasia is a Soviet Union. Like what do Kyrgyzstan and Estonia have in common, really? They're part of Eurasia. I mean, and so I think now the Russian Empire was or Russia as an entity, as a country, whether a nation or empire, it's been around a lot longer than the Soviet Union was. But I think it's hard for me to really imagine that there's going to be a kind of an intellectual balkanization of Russian studies into Tatar studies or like Far East studies, or I think still like Russia is going to be a very persistent, consistent umbrella for research on that territory of the world, even if we see a disintegration of Russian state or some kind of, even if it's like decentralization or true federalization or something like that. So I think these intellectual categories, they tend to be pretty sticky, and if Eurasia is still with us as a category, from my perspective, a remnant of the Cold War, then I think Russia is going to be with us even longer as a core organizing principle for academic research on that part of the world. That's my perspective.
Thank you. Michael Keyes. I'm a State Department detailee here to the Kennan Institute. And so a few observations and then a question. If I were to answer your survey, if I had taken your survey, I would say something like this. I went to UC San Diego. I had a couple courses on Soviet politics and Soviet foreign policy, and I studied Russian there, and I wanted to work in either the military or the U.S. government on issues concerning Russia. I went there in the mid-90s with the U.S. Foreign Service, worked in the U.S. Embassy, kind of scratched that itch. It was really interesting to study Russia, Russian culture, and to be there at that time. But by 1997, when I left, the dominant narrative on Russia was that it was Upper Volta with nuclear weapons, and it was a highly corrupt place. And it had lost that kind of appeal, if you'd say, that interest about it that it was when it was the center of the Soviet Union. So I went away from Russia for a long time, and I came back to it in 2016 when I went to the Russian Far East to head our consulate there, because Russia was interesting again. It's a major player in the world, and I thought I had something to be able to contribute to our understanding of Russia within the U.S. government. So that's just for what that's worth. I think we're seeing part of this is a generational shift. Younger people aren't interested in the world in general, and in history prior to 2000, they're not interested, right? So that plays out, I think, probably in many disciplines in university. My question, I didn't see it, maybe it's in there, but I was wondering how maybe whatever happened to student exchanges or anything in the late 80s and 90s, if that has any impact on this. Because if you don't have a flow of young people, high school, college-age people going to a country, I would imagine you'd see just a decrease in interest in that overall.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, and thanks for your personal background. I mean, that's very interesting, and it does sound, not atypical. That sort of Russia was not interesting by the end of the 90s, and at least in the U.S., I think there was a lot more attention first directed toward the Middle East, fighting ISIS and Islamic terrorism, and then of course China sort of replaced Now, Russia did have a comeback, and I think 2014 was an important part of that. First of all, or even 2012 is when it started, and it got a further impetus from 2014, and even more from 2016 and the allegations of election interference and so forth. And so I mean, I think Russia, historically, the level of interest in Russia clearly seems to be positively related to the degree to which Russia is perceived as a threat to U.S. interests. And so I think that, it's quite clear. And I also think that, in response to your second question, so it brings me back to the first assessment, which I did back in 2015. And there, the real concern there was that, okay, Russian studies has really taken a hit in terms of declining numbers of enrollment, and you can quantify things like that with enrollments in Russian language courses, substantially down over the course. There was a surge in the 90s originally because there was lots of, as I imagine yourself, there was lots of enthusiasm. So part of it was I started graduate school in 1989. I was in sociology. They were teaching me about Weber and Durkheim and Marx. I was like, but what's happening? The Berlin Wall is coming down. What? Isn't that sociologically more interesting than Weber and Durkheim and Marx? And so in the 90s, there was a lot of people went into the field because it seemed like a time of tremendous optimism. Like something good was going to come out of the fall of the Soviet Union. There was a tremendous effervescence in the society, in the other, not just in Russia, in other countries too. You could go to Ukraine, you could go to Kyrgyzstan, you could go to Estonia, and it drew people in the field because it wasn't just this kind of dark, sad place where things are just really bad and we have to figure out how to deal with this threat to us. It was maybe some of that underlying too, but I think that really sort of waned by the end of the 90s, already in the 2000s, and then it's a shift in the reasons why people were drawn to Russia, from one where there was a combination of, well, yes, there was always lingering Cold War, like Russia did still have all those bombs, and they have large Muslim populations, they have lots of oil and gas. Like there's always been good security related reasons to be concerned about Russia. They never really went away, but what I think got lost after the 90s was precisely that sense of optimism and hope. And now it's being replaced by the sense of okay, this is a real threat. This is a country that does engage in kinetic wars with its neighbors and tries to undermine U.S. elections and so I think that arc and trajectory is visible. In terms of the exchanges, I think there was a huge gap. There was a huge decline in the 2000s. I think maybe we saw a bit of an uptick in recent years, but now with the combined effects of COVID, I mean, there are no exchanges now. Even the people who go to study Russia, through NCEP or something like that, through the DoD programs, we have a Russian language flagship program at Wisconsin, and already 6 years ago, I think we started sending to Latvia or to Kazakhstan to get their native exposure to Russian language. So that's already been, that's over. It's just not going to happen. And in terms of Russians coming to the U.S., I myself have argued. I've written a poem as policy member. I think that's something that the U.S. can. Right now, I think it's hard for Russians. They're taking a big risk by leaving Russia to come, and I think right now, but I think it's something that the U.S. would be well advised to continue to pursue. I think the extent that Russians can come not just to the U.S. but to European countries to get a sense of what life really is like, not just from the propaganda that they read, but also to get exposure to the marketplace of ideas. It can't be a bad thing. So I would really encourage the U.S. governments, other governments, to do whatever they can to maintain those links as best as possible, as difficult as it can be. And as much as, again, the priority really does have to be supporting Ukraine and helping Ukrainians. But at the same time, we have to find ways to try to keep the ties and the links open with Russia.
Thanks very much. I have one last question, and that concerns the subject that you've just talked about, as to whether the diaspora Russians are being utilized or can be utilized going forward as a new source of information, of teaching, of scholarship that would really advance U.S. scholarship. And obviously, the more that we go for foreign academics, U.S. academics, I'm pretty sure, will feel left out. So to what extent is there really a possibility to utilize foreign Russian scholars and Ukrainian scholars, for that matter, and will there be resistance to that?
Well, I mean, I think, so there's multiple layers to that question, which is a great question again. And I really, I want to say that I really appreciate this audience and the very well-informed and difficult questions you're asking. So I think the answer to the first question, is there support? Are they being utilized? Are there efforts? I would say somewhat. I think, for example, I think, GWU here has a very nice program of supporting exiled or displaced Russian scholars, sustaining them. I think Harvard has been doing some stuff at the Davis Center, at the Wisconsin Russia Project. We have a very small program. There's lots more going on in Europe. I think in Germany, particularly, comes to mind where I know, like personally, I know a lot of Russian scholars who are now in Germany. I think so I would say by and large, I would give the whole set of institutions. I mean, I'm a professor. I was just grading midterms this morning. I give it an A-. Like I think so far so good, but I think there's a problem in that a lot of the types of support has been very short-term, understandably. And I think it's not so much a problem. It's not so much the donor side that's a problem, but the problem is just that the demands are too great. The needs are too large. They can't be met, and it just doesn't work. It's not sustainable. We can't keep giving Russian scholars 6 months here, 1 year here. There's going to have to be a winnowing. There's going to have to be more of a concentrated effort, a more of a systematic, organized, coordinated effort where different stakeholders can choose different parts of the Russian exiled diaspora scholarly community to support in different ways. I think the piecemeal approach that we've seen so far, it's done enough to keep these diaspora communities alive, but you can see the writing on the wall. And as the war persists, which it seems likely to do, it's going to get harder and harder to maintain. So I think what we need is some kind of like meeting of the minds where the main stakeholders in this process come together and think strategically, like what's going to be. We sort of got through the first almost now 2 years of the war, and now we can't continue just kind of spinning our wheels and throwing bits and pieces of money, pockets of money here and there. We need a much more integrated strategic approach. In terms of the potential resistance of U.S. scholars, I don't really see much evidence of that. And again, I say that as a senior, long tenured, et cetera, person. The younger scholars, I don't think they really perceive that the Russians would be competition. I really don't envision a world where there's going to be a large influx of Russian scholars who are going to get tenure-track positions at American. There's a few now. After many years of trying, we're starting to make inroads, but I don't think the answer is going to be tenure-track positions. I think there's going to have to be kinds of intermediary positions, and I think most American PhD students, like that's still what they're, or American U.S. based, whatever their nationality is, their goal is to get tenure-track jobs in universities. And so I think maybe in Europe there's a little more kind of that competition going on. I think the bigger issue is Ukrainians and Russians, and I think understandably from my perspective, but still awkwardly, like many Ukrainians don't want to have anything to do with. I have Ukrainian grad students, I have Ukrainian colleagues, I have Russian, and it's really a difficult balancing act, and I can't, I'm not here to blame. I completely understand that sentiment, but it really represents a challenge because I think appropriately, like we need, as you also mentioned, Will, we need to build more capacity among Ukrainian researchers. We need to, as a community, all we can to support their own research abilities, to give them opportunities. And trying to do that and support Russians at the same time is extremely tricky, not only because of the limited funds, but also because of the difficulties of having those two communities, as you know better than I do, from your own work and so I don't think it's hopeless. I think we need to try, but I think that is probably a more significant challenge. And so my hat's really off to the Kennan, for moving in that direction, and for all those who are trying to do so under a very difficult and trying situation.
Well, thanks very much, Ted, for sharing this really important research. I also want to thank everyone who has attended, both in person and online, and a special thank you to the Association for Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies and the Carnegie Corporation of New York for making this presentation possible. Please visit our website to stay up to date with the Kennan Institute, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.